Okay, let's unpack this. Let's really get into that feeling. We've all had it. You find yourself scrolling through old photos, maybe deep into the night, 3 a.m.
Oh, yeah.
Phone is bright against the dark room. And you're not looking for information about the past, are you?
No, not at all.
You're actively looking for a face, a setting, a version of yourself that just feels, and this is the core of our dive today, lighter.
Lighter is the perfect word for it. It's more than just a passing feeling, isn't it? It's this instinctive, really powerful, and almost immediate retreat.
A retreat.
Yeah. And that instinct, it generates a thought that feels so natural, so self-evident, that almost nobody, and this includes you, the listener, ever stops to question it.
Which is what?
Back then, everything just seemed better.
Yeah.
We just accept that premise instantly, no questions asked.
And that acceptance, that's the key to this entire deep dive. This is all based on a really profound philosophical and psychological analysis focusing on memory, present-day fatigue, and the mechanism of idealizing the past. Our sources challenge us to move completely beyond simple sentimentality, oh, the good old days.
Exactly.
To understand the complex cognitive, social, and even existential structures that turn the past into what our sources call a final hiding place.
I love that phrase, a final hiding place. And it means our mission today is to gain some really granular knowledge about why we do this, why we retreat into nostalgia.
Right.
And we're looking at this phenomenon through a very specific and I'd say distinctly Kafkaesque lens.
Kafkaesque. Okay, so what does that mean in this context?
It means that lens immediately shifts the focus. We are not going to ask the question, was the past truly better?
Which is what we always ask.
It's the only question we ask.
Yeah.
Kafka would ask a colder, much more functional question, and this is really the framing for our whole conversation. Why does memory need to be beautiful?
Wow. Okay, that reframes the entire conversation instantly. It completely moves us away from history, from facts, and into the critical territory of psychological function. So we're discussing memory not as, a passive record keeper, which is how we usually see it.
That's the default assumption. We think of it like a hard drive.
Yeah, a playback device.
But it's not. The sources argue it's an active, high-level maintenance system designed specifically for emotional survival in a really, really demanding environment.
Okay, I think we have to jump in right there. So let's start where that journey begins for all of us, which is the immediate trigger. The sources describe our current reality, the present, as a Kafkaesque corridor. And, if you're familiar with Kafka's work, that imagery immediately suggests something. What? Endless.
Overwhelming.
And overwhelmingly administrative. That's the key. The question is, what exactly makes this present so impossibly heavy?
Right.
The sources define the present as a place where every single door you open leads to a new mandatory obligation.
Not a new opportunity. A new obligation. A new obligation. Just think about the sheer density of modern life that you have to navigate every single hour of the day. It's that stack of unanswered messages, professional and personal, that require these immediate, tailored responses.
And they just keep coming.
They never stop. It's the looming specter of unfinished work that just bleeds into your personal time. It's the crushing weight of financial anxieties, rent, utilities, future planning.
And on top of that, it's the invisible pressure of expectations, which is almost worse, isn't it?
It is, because it's so diffuse. It's not just from bosses or clients. It's the expectation to fulfill this vast array of roles and titles. You have to be a good parent, an efficient employee, a present partner, an informed citizen, a person with a hobby you're actively cultivating.
And you have to perform all of those roles all the time and maintain those definitions for everyone else to see.
Every single day, we are required to prove that we are not just existing, but that we are actively okay. That we are successfully keeping up with this relentless administrative and, self-reinforcing structure.
So the present demands constant, active, energy-consuming engagement.
That's it.
And that is the core fundamental difference right there. The present is inherently demanding. It constantly requires a response from you, an update, a proof of performance.
Wow, the past.
The past is beautifully soothing because it's definitively done. It's a finished product. It requires no utility, no action, no update from you.
And this brings us directly to what the text identifies as the great misconception about memory. We suffer from this silent, almost universal confusion. We truly believe the past we remember, the past that just pops up when we're tired,
is the past that actually existed.
That's what we think, but it's not.
So the sources are arguing that memory isn't video playback. It's what, post-production?
It's highly subjective, highly motivated post-production editing. The beautiful past, we recall, is simply an edited record. It's a file that has been surgically cleaned of all the unpleasant, the chaotic, the inconvenient details.
You know, the brain, they suggest, cannot afford to remember a whole day.
It's too much data.
Too much data, so we only retain the pieces that are safe, useful, or maybe just easy enough to hold on to without emotional drain.
Let's break down the specific examples of how memory performs this editing function, because I think this is where the theory becomes really visceral for the listener.
Okay.
The source points out how we routinely transform genuinely challenging, difficult experiences into something soft and aesthetically pleasing.
Okay, give me an example.
For instance, think of a rainy college afternoon. At the time, maybe you were desperately trying to finish a paper, you were struggling with a toxic roommate, or you were worrying about whether your student loans would cover rent for the next month.
So real present anxiety.
Exactly. Now, years later, that memory is simply packaged and recalled as carefree time. We remember the aesthetic of the rain, the cheap coffee, but not the existential dread of incompleteness.
We forget the feeling in our stomach, we just remember the image.
We just remember the image. Or consider a low-paying job we had 10 years ago. When we were in it, it was stressful, the manager was difficult, it barely covered the bills.
You are counting every dollar.
You were. Now, in a rearview mirror, we categorize those as the simple years. We systematically strip away the daily financial anxiety, the exhaustion of the commute, the workplace politics, and we retain only the perceived simplicity of a time when we didn't have as many professional responsibilities.
It's funny how that works, and this editing mechanism, it must extend powerfully into our closest relationships, right?
Oh, absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
The sources detail how a relationship that may have been defined by long periods of awkward silence, maybe even discomfort or distance because you were both immature,
Right.
is remembered not for that friction, but as when we were still trusting or when everything was spontaneous.
You remember the first date, not the 5 awkward ones that followed.
Exactly. The memory keeps the initial excitement, and it just removes the relational risk and uncertainty that defined the daily reality of that time.
So this functional editing leads us to what the source calls the critical realization, the core paradox of this whole section.
Which is that the past is not beautiful because it was inherently happy or inherently easy. The past is beautiful because it demands nothing from us anymore.
It's retired.
It has been definitively retired from the field of current obligations.
That is so profound because it reveals the mechanism of that retreat. When you are scrolling through those 3 a.m. photos, the memory you access has zero utility except for emotional relief.
That's its only job.
It doesn't challenge you. It doesn't ask the relentless administrative questions the present is screaming at you, like, who are you now 10 years later? What have you achieved since then? Where exactly are you going with all this effort?
No, it doesn't ask any of that.
It only whispers that one soft, non-judgmental line. That day, you were someone else and you don't have to update that version.
And that appeal to the tired self.
Yeah.
The chance to momentarily be that other person without the administrative burden, that's why the retreat is so effective. So let's look at the 2 practical anecdotes the source uses to really illustrate this filtering process.
Okay.
Let's start with the work life versus student life comparison.
Okay, I think a lot of people will relate to this. Take a person 10 years into their established career. Maybe they're financially stable, but they're fatigued by the administrative weight and the corporate politics. And they remember their student days with this intense fondness. They recall the cheap, maybe slightly sour coffee, the aimless talks that stretched late into the night.
And that crucial feeling.
The feeling of being nobody yet. That specific feeling of not being defined by your output or your title.
But what is systematically, ruthlessly forgotten by memory's editing function?
Everything else.
They forget the paralyzing anxiety about finding a job in the first place, the nights consumed by the fear that they weren't good enough or smart enough to compete, the feeling of being completely small and unneeded by the world outside the college walls.
You just file all that away under character building and forget the pain.
Exactly. The key insight here is that memory operates like this powerful, specialized compression filter. It retains the aesthetic image, the coffee shop, the rain, the conversation.
But it ruthlessly removes the emotional pressure and the financial instability that were the actual burdens of that time.
And we observe this exact same protective mechanism at play in the relationship anecdote. The comparison between long-term commitment, say marriage, and the heady rush of first love.
Okay.
A person in a long-term, stable marriage might intensely romanticize the fast heartbeat and the excitement of first love, the way everything felt so incomplete, like it was full of endless, unwritten promise.
And they forget the cost of that incompleteness.
Completely.
They forget the long, painful misunderstandings that arose from just bad communication. They forget the excruciatingly awkward silences that came before they truly learned to trust each other, and all the nameless, creeping anxieties that came with that initial uncertainty and fragility.
So the sources are unequivocal here. This process is not memory lying to you in some malicious sense.
Right, it's not trying to trick you.
No, this is memory fulfilling its core protective function. It is shielding us, the individual, from the weight of the present by offering a purified version of the past as a temporary, guilt-free refuge.
And I think Kafka would understand that perfectly. The individual is often oppressed not by a single visible enemy, but by these invisible, dense structures that force them to constantly contract themselves, to constantly prove their worth.
And the present is where we must perpetually adapt to those structures.
While the past, having been closed and filed away, becomes a structureless zone where adaptation is completely unnecessary.
And so, we begin to use memory as a powerful and highly efficient refuge, not to genuinely understand our own history, but simply to escape the current responsibility.
Which means the painful, functional conclusion of this entire section is this: the past might not have been inherently better than the present at all.
It's just that the present has become so impossibly heavy, so dense, and so demanding that we need a location that demands absolutely nothing from us, just so we can psychologically catch our breath and remain functional.
That transition from history to function is so critical. So now let's move into the precise psychological mechanics of this retreat. The sources provide a really precise, almost alarming data point, which they call the 7-second decision point.
Yeah, this is fascinating.
When fatigue or intense stress hits your system, you have an average of only 7 seconds to decide whether you're going to stay and endure the pressure of the present.
Or whether you're going to flee into the past.
7 seconds.
And in those 7 seconds, the brain does not conduct some complex, logical, existential review, weighing the pros and cons of your current responsibilities.
It doesn't have time.
It's asking a much simpler, survival-oriented, primal question. Is there anywhere immediately less painful or demanding? And memory, because it's already processed, already safe, and already framed, provides the quickest, most immediately available answer.
So the common belief that we recall the past because it was inherently important or joyous is actually secondary. It's almost a symptom.
It's a justification after the fact. The difficult underlying truth is that we recall the past primarily because the present has become overloaded, too demanding, and too complex to sustain gracefully.
And if we stick to that Kafkaesque perspective, we wouldn't describe the brain as an honest machine dedicated to objective truth.
Not at all. We would describe it, as the sources suggest, as a silent, diligent clerk working in the back office, constantly editing and redacting documents behind the scenes.
Why?
To ensure the entire system, the individual psyche, doesn't collapse under the overwhelming weight of incoming, unresolved, high-pressure information. Memory's core duty is simply to keep you functional, not to provide an accurate historical record.
Which leads directly to the core cognitive mechanism here, filtering.
Right. When the present becomes dense with obligations, with expectations, with the necessity of fulfilling all these roles, memory initiates a filtration process. It doesn't erase all the pain that would shatter realism and we'd know something was wrong.
It has to feel real.
It has to feel real. But it pushes the pain deep into the background, into the file archive. It retains only the gentle, simple details required for us to maintain the belief that, structurally, things used to be easier.
And this is a crucial distinction we have to make clear for you, the listener. This process is fundamentally not romanticism or deep emotional yearning.
No, it's pure, pragmatic survival optimization. It is the brain making a very efficient cost-benefit analysis for emotional endurance.
Let's try to ground this in the concept the sources call the silent memory. This is a moment we've all experienced. You're standing, maybe in a busy elevator after a 12-hour administrative day. You are exhausted, your phone vibrates, another work notification, another demand for your attention, another task added to the list.
Yeah, right then, against that chaos, you access a completely different afternoon from a time of less immediate responsibility. Maybe it's a quiet moment watching rainfall or reading a novel without interruption.
And that memory is not chosen because it was the happiest day of your life or even the most eventful one.
No, it's chosen specifically because it requires no response from you. It is silent. That quiet memory acts as an instantaneous internal micro-vacation from the chaos and the noise of the constantly demanding present.
And this taps directly into that Kafkaesque experience of being constantly enclosed. His characters are perpetually caught in these opaque processes that never conclude, where every day requires a better, more accountable version of themselves.
Right. When you can't escape that relentless process externally, you retreat inward. Memory becomes an unlocked room, a safe space you can enter without having to prove anything or file an update.
Now, psychology does have a label for this tendency, doesn't it? The nostalgia bias.
It does, or in the original text, tien kinohaniet, which literally translates to the bias toward remembering things as finished and ideal.
I like that.
But the source wisely points out that merely naming the bias doesn't diminish its danger, and the danger is deeply insidious, and it's twofold. This mechanism doesn't just make the past look good, it actively, systematically, and inevitably makes the present look dramatically worse by comparison.
This is the essence of the comparison fallacy. The present is literally designed to lose when it's measured against the past.
It's a fixed fight.
And the fundamental reason why, it's because the past is finished. It has a neat, clean, known ending and a fixed frame. It's a story with a conclusion, and we know exactly how we made it through.
The present, by sharp contrast, is unfinished. It is messy, it is dirty, and it is full of thousands of tiny, ambiguous details whose ultimate outcomes are still completely unknown.
We're in the middle of the story.
We are. And the brain, the sources note, inherently hates incompleteness, or dang. It prefers the clarity of stories that have resolutions. Memory provides that psychological completion. The present only offers exhausting ambiguity.
So the underlying difficult truth we are forced to face is this. We don't necessarily remember the past because we love its reality.
We remember it because we cannot endure the unfinished, open-ended, and demanding feeling of the present moment.
The sources suggest that we don't truly live in objective time. We live in these time records we constantly self-edit and maintain.
And those records, that purified file of the past, are instantly rewritten and polished, specifically whenever the administrative or emotional pressure of the present becomes too tight or overwhelming to bear.
There's a very powerful reflection in the text on the self-awareness gained from this process, what they call a personal scar. This is the admission of finding yourself falling into this memory trap, not just on truly terrible days, but simply on those vast stretches of days that are average, difficult, administrative, and overloaded with tasks that never truly reach completion.
Yes, the mundane days.
The mundane days.
And in those moments when the sheer weight of the ongoing process becomes unbearable, the old memory appears as this gentle, almost seductive invitation. Just come back here for a moment. This file is complete and safe.
And when we analyze the cold reality of that retreat, the realization is stark. We are not returning to remember a happy time or glean insight.
No, we are returning to escape the immediate responsibility of having to continue the present tasks for the next 7 seconds.
And if we allow Kafka's consequence to land here, it's frightening. If memory becomes a frequent primary refuge, the present will be slowly, subconsciously abandoned.
Not because the present is inherently terrible or not worth living,
but simply because we haven't acquired the internal mechanisms, the patience, to stay with it while it is still messy, ambiguous, and unbeautiful.
So the unconsoling final realization of this psychological loop is that the past isn't judged as better than the present because it was inherently superior. It's simply better because it has already been efficiently processed, polished, and finished by our protective memory system. We just lack the cognitive patience required to fully inhabit the unfinished, messy, exhausting part of now.
We've established how the individual mind edits the file for protection, for survival, but that individual memory does not form in a vacuum, does it?
Not at all.
So let's zoom out now to the societal level. The sources argue that society, just like the individual, has a deep functional need for the past to be idealized and deemed superior.
Absolutely. The source highlights the overwhelming power of what they call the consensus statement.
What's that?
This is the phrase repeated for 30 years at family meals, in cafes, on television, at gatherings. Life was simpler back then, or easier back then.
You hear it everywhere.
It's transmitted not as an opinion, but as an undeniable, self-evident truth. It becomes completely immune to rational doubt simply because it has been repeated so frequently and so universally.
And the true Kafka question shifts here. He wouldn't waste time asking if that statement is historically true or false.
No, that's irrelevant.
He asks, who needs it to be true? And that question points the finger directly at the collective societal need for a beautifully constructed, idealized past.
Society, much like the fatigued individual brain, deeply dislikes the present. And why? Because the present is structurally unstable, it is constantly unfinished, and it relentlessly asks the most difficult questions that require collective action and responsibility.
Questions like,
what is wrong with our current system, and where exactly are we going as a society? That level of uncertainty and ambiguity creates overwhelming collective anxiety.
but the past, well, the past is a perfectly compliant subject.
Completely. It can be framed, it can be named, it can be recounted without resistance, and most importantly, it cannot resist being edited or mythologized to suit our current needs.
So particularly during periods of high collective fatigue, economic uncertainty, or social instability.
Collective memory efficiently creates an idealized former time or a golden age. The purpose of this former time is never historical accuracy.
Right.
It only needs to be beautiful enough and simple enough to serve as a vastly favorable point of comparison for the demanding present.
And we see the explicit examples of these collective myths embedded in our daily conversations. People were kinder, more genuine, and less transactional then.
Or there wasn't as much pressure to perform, consume, or succeed then.
These statements are not designed to be accurate historical descriptions, are they?
Not in the slightest. They are purely functional. They are meant to immediately soothe the current collective anxiety by providing a simple, easily digestible, and comforting narrative about why things feel so difficult, so exhausting, and so complex now.
It's like Kafka understood that the system doesn't need to lie outright.
No, it just needs to repeat the most convenient, psychologically comforting story until no one remembers they had the right or even the need to doubt it in the first place.
And society actively rewards this selective memory. It teaches us how to remember the past collectively.
Exactly.
You see it in the ritualized example of an older generation recounting their youth. They emphasize the simple meals, the evenings without the intrusion of phones, the profound, sincere quality of relationships.
But what is systematically omitted from this widely shared collective narrative?
Oh, much.
They omit the prolonged and exhausting financial worries that defined the pre-internet age. They omit the severe lack of personal and professional choices they simply never had compared to today. They omit the structural limits they couldn't overcome in a less mobile society.
And the text notes something critical here. Society simply does not reward complex, nuanced, or ambiguous memories.
No, it wants the highlight reel.
It fiercely prefers beautiful, clean, and easily digestible stories. When you share a complicated memory one where the good and the bad were hopelessly mixed, people often just tune out.
They do. They want to hear the aesthetic of simplicity, not the ambiguity of real experience.
This is so starkly visible in the pervasive social media loop. You see it every single day. An old, maybe filtered photo posted with the succinct, often used caption, "Peaceful days."
Right. And the sources challenge us to ask the critical questions nobody in the comment section ever asks. Which peaceful for whom, exactly? And at what social or financial cost was that perceived peace maintained?
But no one asks. That post gets thousands of likes, not because the image is historically accurate or tells a complete story,
but because it fulfills a deep, collective, and immediate need to believe that there was once a location in time, a golden age, that simply didn't hurt, confuse, or demand as much as the now.
The sources refer to this phenomenon as the silent consensus, or in the original, akin unlen.
We mutually and tacitly agree that the past was beautiful, simple, and superior, so that we can avoid the excruciating difficulty of facing how genuinely demanding, unstable, and complex the present is to live through.
And this beautiful collective memory is constantly reinforced through powerful social rituals. Anniversaries, shared golden age stories, ubiquitous nostalgia-filtered media.
And there is a clear social cost for non-compliance. Those individuals who try to inject realism, the difficulty, the hardship, the ambiguity into the collective memory often feel isolated or dismissed.
Nobody wants to hear it.
So individual memory naturally and quickly aligns with collective memory. Not because the collective memory is true, but because in a state of administrative exhaustion, to be different is to be utterly lonely.
This collective need creates a grand, frustrating, Kafkaesque contradiction.
It does. Society, through its loudest voices, tells us, live fully in the present.
But it simultaneously rewards those who tell the most beautiful, curated, and simplest stories about the past.
It tells us, move forward, innovate, adapt. but constructs our entire cultural identity based on what is already past.
And caught in that powerful contradiction, we stand in perpetual comparison mode.
And Kafka argued that comparison is a subtle form of judgment, a continuous trial that never actually convicts anyone but always fatally fatigues the judged person, which is the present self.
When we compare the unfinished, messy, ongoing present to a socially idealized, purified past,
The present always consistently loses. It loses not because it is inherently bad or lacking. It loses simply because it is still alive, it is still happening, it's still asking questions.
which means the past is not only individually beautified by our survival mechanisms, but it is collectively edited and reinforced by society so that we have a ready-made, simple, and socially acceptable story to explain why living now is such an exhausting, administrative, and overwhelming endeavor. So, this cycle of continuous comparison, both individually and collectively reinforced, carries an extremely heavy existential cost.
It really does.
If you sit quietly for 10 minutes and reflect on why you feel tired, and why old times seem structurally less tiring, you don't receive a simple answer, do you?
No, you get this deep, pervasive, strange feeling that the sources describe as the displacement of the self, or sunakshokabhanan.
The displacement of the self, what does that mean?
It means we are alive, but we are not fully emotionally present in our own unfolding lives.
The self, your core identity, doesn't know where to firmly stand when the present is constantly held up to and judged against a superior, beautified past.
The logic is simple, but brutal. If the present is viewed as fundamentally temporary, low quality, or substandard, the self will not invest its energy or its emotional vulnerability in it.
Why would it?
Exactly. If the past is the default standard of worth, the self perpetually feels like it is failing or losing ground.
And we become trapped, living in this strange psychological holding pattern. We're waiting for something that has already passed, that feeling of back then, to magically return or align with our current reality.
So the only true standard against which our current decisions and emotions are judged is now, hooey, back then.
This becomes the constant internal monologue of judgment. Back then, we were more carefree. Back then, we were more sincere and less guarded. Back then, we were more authentic.
And the sheer act of repeatedly articulating and believing these nostalgic phrases performs a deep, dangerous action. It aggressively thins the present.
Thins the present. I like that phrasing. And when the present is thinned, everything loses its necessary weight, doesn't it?
Everything. All current efforts are seen as temporary or provisional. Current relationships feel measured against some older, idealized, purer version. All current emotions are dismissed as not what they used to be.
We are actively, emotionally withdrawing from the now because it simply cannot win the rigged comparison fight.
And this is a profound and subtle form of alienation, or thahoa, which means loss of self or estrangement.
But crucially, it's not the classic Marxist alienation being deprived of property or status by an external corporate force.
No, it's so much more insidious. It is being actively deprived of our own present reality by the way we ourselves choose to remember. We are cognitively alienating ourselves from the now through our own protective but ultimately self-defeating thought processes.
The sources offer a simple, powerful, everyday moment that exposes this process. It's when you meet an old friend you haven't seen in years. You engage in the social ritual, you talk politely, you catch up cordially, but you go home and you don't actually think about the content of the current cordial conversation.
No. Yeah. You think exclusively about the version of the two of you from back then, the version the memory has perfected.
And the current interaction wasn't necessarily bad, it was just a human moment unfolding. But it simply didn't match the powerful, upheld, and nurtured memory.
The present is not allowed the dignity to simply exist as itself. It must constantly strive to compete with the past, and it invariably fails, pushing the self into a state of continuous disappointment.
And Kafka suggests that when people no longer allow the present to exist without judgment, they start living like perpetual defendants in their own lives.
Wow.
Every single day, every single interaction becomes an unspoken trial against the standard of the past. Every decision is implicitly asked, is this worthy of back then?
And the answer, under this system of unfair comparison, is almost always no.
This brings us to the heavy existential paradox that defines the modern predicament. The more idealized, polished, and powerful the past becomes,
the smaller, more temporary, and more insignificant the current self feels. We dare not invest deep, unguarded emotion. We hold back high expectations. We refuse to commit fully to the present because if the present cannot be as beautiful or as simple as the edited past, why bother taking it seriously at all?
This leads to the source's incredibly strong concluding statement for this section. This pervasive pattern isn't genuine nostalgia.
No.
Kafka would call this a powerful, sophisticated refusal to live disguised by the acceptable language of memory. It is a state of prolonged mental and emotional suspension.
The text mentions that personal scar again, reflecting on what it's like to live in this state of extended suspension, doing the work, maintaining relationships, living life, but with this foundational thought humming in the background.
What thought?
This isn't the real segment of my life. The real segment has already passed. The implication is that we're just walking through the remainder until something better or simpler happens again.
And the fatigue from that is immense. The fatigue comes from the realization that the self cannot endure being continuously postponed or discounted.
The self requires radical presence to fully form and stabilize.
So if the present is perpetually viewed as inferior, the truly uncomfortable final question emerges. Are we efficiently using the past as a perfectly rational, socially acceptable excuse not to fully show up and live now?
That's the question. The past is beautiful not just because of what happened, but because it grants us psychological permission to actively avoid the risk, the messiness, and the effort of having to fully show up and be present in a confusing reality we are not yet ready to face or accept.
Let's pivot now from those internal mechanisms to the overwhelming external structure that forces us into this psychological retreat. The sources start with a terrifying, tangible data point that encapsulates modern fatigue.
This one really hit me.
Seeing 48 notifications, emails, texts, app reminders, social media alerts before you've even finished your first cup of coffee.
48 items requiring attention. And the crucial point is that they aren't necessarily crises or accidents or catastrophic bad news.
No, they're just little things.
They are simply dense, small, ubiquitous reminders of unresolved tasks. This relentless density, this continuous fragmented stream of demands, is the core structural problem that forces the retreat into nostalgia.
And Kafka's critique of structure, applied here, is not that society is intentionally cruel, is it?
No, not at all. It's that it systematically denies people the essential mental space for the present to exist, merely as the present, as an empty, unobligated moment.
Our current reality is no longer a moment in time. It is a continuously updated, exhausting checklist of obligations.
We must constantly reply, update, demonstrate, and prove that we are still in the game. No one is explicitly holding a gun to our head, but slowing down means being immediately overlooked, being deemed unresponsive.
Or perhaps falling completely out of the administrative system that supports your income and your identity.
Exactly. And because of this demanding, highly responsive structure, the present becomes a place that perpetually requires justification and explanation.
We are constantly fielding queries, aren't we? Why haven't you replied to that email yet? Why haven't you achieved that benchmark? Why aren't you fine and coping efficiently like everyone else seems to be on social media?
And this is the essence of the lived Kafka-esque experience. We feel perpetually summoned to answer, just like his characters, without ever fully knowing the specific charge against us.
We are constantly running, responding, and performing, but the finish line for being caught up keeps moving further away, guaranteeing perpetual incompleteness.
And the radical contrast is the past. The past is the only location that never puts us on trial. It requires no explanation from us.
It needs no update, no proof of performance, no active metrics. The past, miraculously, sends 0 notifications.
So the modern structure doesn't teach us to be nostalgic directly. It does something far more subtle and powerful. It makes the current, continuous, fragmented present simply unbearable to sustain without psychic collapse. The sources note how our life rhythm is systematically fragmented, our attention is aggressively shredded.
And our complex emotions don't have the necessary silence or time to settle and form properly before we are instantly forced to pivot to the next incoming task.
And in those conditions, where time is sharded into these 7-second segments of response, the present is not and cannot be deeply felt.
And a present that is not deeply felt, that's not emotionally inhabited, cannot possibly compete with a past that memory has already polished, framed, and made aesthetically tangible and whole.
Kafka would suggest that we are not actually living in the present. We are constantly being processed by it.
Processed by it.
Everything that arrives, a relationship interaction, a work project, a financial obligation, arrives as a file to be resolved. Resolve one task and the next 2 immediately appear in the queue. There is no empty space, no downtime for authentic emotion to form and breathe.
And when emotions can't form or settle in the rush demanding now, people naturally seek places where their feelings were clear, distinct, and uncomplicated.
The past. Not necessarily because the past was objectively better, but because it had a slower, more deliberate, and less administratively demanding rhythm.
It is so vital to clarify the distinction here, to avoid falling into cheap, technology-hating nostalgia.
It's not about the tech itself.
The core issue is not simply that there was less technology back then. The central issue is that the structure of the present has been fundamentally transformed into a continuous, unbroken chain of tasks that must be instantaneously completed, or at least acknowledged.
The demand for readiness is overwhelming and totalizing. Modern structure judges people by their ability to always be ready, always online, always responsive, and always available.
And the past is the only place in time that doesn't demand that ready status or measure us against that impossible metric.
Therefore, the natural reflex, the sources conclude, is to return to memory when we are tired, not to genuinely relive life, but to consciously, desperately stop being processed.
That is the true functional utility of the nostalgic retreat.
The past is beautiful, not because it was inherently good, but because it stopped demanding continuous, exhausting responsiveness in a present that has simply become too dense and too heavy to remain in without internal collapse.
Okay, so if the problem is this perfectly edited file, this continuous comparison, and these heavy structural demands, how do we break this self-defeating mechanism without simply lying to ourselves about how genuinely difficult things are right now?
Right, because denial is not a strategy.
No, the sources suggest a set of uncomfortable, anti-intuitive strategies for staying anchored in the unbeautiful present.
And Kafka would never ask you to suddenly find joy in the present. That would be a cruel and unrealistic request given the administrative weight we just discussed.
He would ask only one small, incredibly difficult thing.
Don't turn the present into the loser from the start. We must immediately stop rigging the comparison contest.
This begins with strategy 1, restoring the real weight of memory. The immediate task is to stop comparing the complex present to that meticulously edited, purified past.
And the trick isn't simply telling yourself, don't think about the past. That never works. It requires a cold, analytical counteraction at the moment of recall.
Okay, what does that look like in practice?
When a beautiful, idealized memory appears and draws you in, say, you're scrolling through photos of a college trip and seeing only sun-drenched, carefree faces. You must immediately ask it a cold, specific question.
And that question is?
Where precisely is your uncomfortable part? The goal is not to destroy the memory's value or its happiness, but to restore its true, complex weight. Beautiful, complicated memories are not dangerous. Memories that have been stripped of all unpleasant, messy parts are the real existential threat.
So let's apply this. When you recall the aesthetic sunset on the beach during that trip, you must actively force yourself to recall a single inconvenient detail associated with that carefree time.
Right. Remember the painful argument that happened the next morning? Or the specific fear of failing the exam waiting for you back home? Or even the smell of the damp, tiny, overcrowded hostel room you hated?
This active counter-recall prevents the present from losing a fixed, rigged fight against a fictional ideal.
Exactly. Strategy 2 is conceptually even more uncomfortable for the modern mind, allowing the present to exist without immediate meaning.
Oof, that's a tough one.
Yeah, it is. Society teaches us that every phase of life must be valuable, every year must contain a lesson, and every emotion must lead somewhere or be Instagrammable.
This constant pressure to find meaning and create a narrative is a continuous form of self-interrogation.
And under continuous interrogation, the present cannot exist naturally. We must grant explicit permission for a period of life to be mundane, repetitive, and unmemorable.
To accept a phase where you might learn no great singular lesson, create no good, shareable stories.
And have no beautiful, polished retelling required for future gatherings. Just simple, quiet existence.
This is profoundly difficult because it temporarily deprives you of a ready-made story to tell about yourself or your purpose.
But this crucial discomfort stops the current moment from being constantly pushed forward, burdened by the need to become the next ideal past. You release it from the obligation to be meaningful.
Okay, then we have strategy 3, delaying escape, which goes completely against our reflexive 7-second instinct to flee when we're tired.
Right, when you feel that powerful urge to retreat into memory, don't use absolute energy-consuming language like, no, I forbid this memory.
To say,
10 more minutes. Stay anchored in the present for 10 more minutes.
This small, seemingly insignificant delay is incredibly powerful because it doesn't confront the desire directly, which usually just leads to resistance.
It simply removes the urgency of the desire. Kafka understood the power of small delays in disrupting overwhelming processes. Often, after those 10 minutes of staying, the memory is no longer urgently necessary. Not because the present miraculously became beautiful,
but because the immediate survival-based need to flee has dissipated.
And strategy 4 is perhaps the most necessary and difficult for the aesthetic-driven modern identity: accepting the unaesthetic.
Meaning, we must accept that some life stages will simply never, ever become beautiful memories. They will remain dull, administrative, ambiguous, or just plain exhausting.
And this acceptance is not about admitting to living incorrectly. It is accepting that not everything needs to be aestheticized, packaged, or wrapped neatly with a positive moral.
Kafka never promised that life would be memorable, did he?
He described it as a series of murky, opaque, and difficult processes that must simply be gone through without any guarantee of a good outcome or a clean narrative.
So when you stop aggressively forcing the present to become a good, past someday story, a truly massive burden is immediately lifted.
The present stops having to compete and only needs to be lived through, endured, or processed. It no longer has to strive for lightness.
The sources include a profound reflection on the relief this provides. Realizing that difficult phases, even if they're just dull, repetitive, and structurally heavy, do not need to be dramatized, colored, or spun into a better narrative for future consumption.
The fatigue only truly begins to lift when we accept the simple, unvarnished truth. This section doesn't need to be beautiful, it just needs to be lived.
And Kafka would not call that process healing. He would call it ceasing self-prosecution.
That's powerful.
If we give the present the unconditional right to be ugly, difficult, or mundane, it fundamentally won't need to turn into a false, edited fictional memory simply to survive its own existence. It stops running from its own weight.
So after implementing those uncomfortable, non-sentimental strategies, the consequence is a necessary and profound realization.
What's that?
Imagine an evening where there is no event, no high drama, and nothing particularly noteworthy to remember later. You're just sitting there fully present, and you realize you have no legitimate, urgent, survival-based reason to retreat into the past anymore.
That moment, the sources say, is not a feeling of soft peace or immediate joy. Kafka would accurately label it the necessary solitude, or Sachutra company.
Right, because when memory stops playing the role of the final protective hiding place, the present is brutally revealed in its true, complex nature.
Which is that it is not beautiful, it is permanently incomplete, and it promises absolutely nothing about tomorrow.
And it is in this solitude, this moment of reckoning with reality, that the true choice must be made.
Yeah.
We must choose. Either continue to diligently beautify the past, day after day, year after year, to successfully avoid the difficulty of enduring the present.
Or choose to stay anchored in the present, not with forced false hope, but with the necessary radical responsibility of simple presence.
And Kafka didn't believe we needed a life with clear, articulated meaning or purpose in the way we often demand it.
No. He described the misery of human beings being denied the ability to simply remain in their own confusing, still unfolding, ambiguous lives without constant judgment.
So the true promised land, therefore, is not a fictional destination where the present miraculously becomes easy, light, or perfected.
It is a state of psychological being where the present is no longer structurally forced to compete with the purified weight and polish of memory.
And when you finally stop whispering the sentence, "back then was infinitely better," you also automatically stop declaring, "now is fundamentally not enough."
The self stops being stretched and exhausted by the perpetual comparison trial across fragmented timeframes.
So the final challenging requirement of life, according to this analysis, is posed as a difficult, almost uncomfortable question.
And that is,
if the present doesn't need to be beautiful, if it is allowed to be messy and heavy, do we still dare to fully live in it?
the sources conclude that most of us don't actually leave the present because it truly hurts in a catastrophic sense. We leave it because it doesn't offer a good, clean, shareable story about who we are.
The past, however, is beautifully compact, safely framed, and can be recounted without hesitation, risk, or anxiety.
But a real life, a life lived without the crutch of perfected memory, is not played out to be told or aestheticized.
It is played out to be endured, to be gone through, day by day, ambiguity and all.
So when we stop using memory to artificially lighten the present, we must directly face our own unique rhythm of life, our own unresolved complexities, and our own lack of a clear ending. This is not easy.
But it is deeply, profoundly, and finally real.
So what does this all mean for you, the learner, right now at the end of this deep dive? We have identified that what we call nostalgia is often a sophisticated, highly efficient survival mechanism.
Reinforced by a societal consensus designed to avoid confronting the unfinished, demanding, and dense administrative nature of the modern present.
The key takeaway is recognizing the fundamental functional difference between the two states of time. The singular, attractive value of the past is that it is finished.
The unrelenting, exhausting challenge of the present is that it is live and it keeps moving.
So we must intentionally practice the uncomfortable strategy of allowing the present to exist without the weight of judgment, without the constant burden of becoming a future golden age story.
Grant the radical right to be mundane, difficult, repetitive, or unbeautiful.
A life doesn't need to be eternally memorable to simply exist.
So if the past is no longer used as a comfortable safe haven, if you stop postponing your full emotional and mental commitment to the now by comparing it to that carefully edited file,
how long are you willing to stay fully present in this life that is currently unfolding, messy details and all?